When you think of developers on the NES, you may consider Konami, Capcom, Nintendo, or Tecmo, but there's one company that doesn't get as much attention. Data East is known for arcade games like BurgerTime, Bad Dudes, and Bump and Jump. We know their arcade games are great, but what about their NES titles? Could there be a reason they're often ignored? Let's take a look. What's going on? It's Pojer coming at you with another video. Alright, we got a great community on Discord server. If you want to be a part of it, just go to discord.pojer.net. We're not going to waste any time. Let's talk about Data East. Founded in 1976, Data East started off with two basic arcade games. Jacklot was a virtual game of blackjack where you had a chance to win coins. Not much of an arcade game, but a decent start. Super Break was their first real arcade game, which came in a tabletop form. Their first successful title was Astro Fighter in 1980, which was a top-down shooter that was similar to Space Invaders. Around this time, Data East came up with a very unique idea for the arcade market. Normally, arcade games only had one game built in. Imagine having a bulky machine in your home and it only plays one game. Data East's new arcade machine, the Deco cassette system, could play multiple games. Instead of having to buy a whole new arcade machine, you could just switch out the cassette and play something else. Some of their most popular games, like Lock and Chase, BurgerTime, and Bump and Jump, would make an appearance on this unit. Unfortunately, some of the games were poor quality, and many people were worried about the cassettes wearing down over time. But the Deco cassette system would inspire other units like the Nintendo Versus system, which was a similar concept. Data East would begin to have some major success in 1984. They developed and published the arcade game Karate Champ, and they published Kung Fu Master and Commando. All three of these became the highest grossing arcade games of 1985. Karate Champ became the first successful fighting game and would set a standard for future fighting games. Data East continued this positive momentum with more arcade hits like Bad Dudes, Heavy Barrel, and Karnov. With success in the arcade, Data East took notice of the rising popularity of home consoles. The Famicom was the best performing console in Japan at the time. There were already well-known third-party companies that signed on to Team Nintendo, so Data East decided to do the same. The first game was B-Wings, also known as Battle Wings. It's a very unique shoot-'em-up. At the beginning, you can select from a big list of weapons. For the most part, it's going to be personal preference which weapon you want to use, but some are more advantageous for certain stages. If you get hit once, you lose your weapon, and if you get hit again, you die. It's always recommended to pick up a weapon as soon as possible if you don't already have one, even if it's a bad weapon. There's barriers that are scattered across the stages that you can break through with your weapons. It's important that you give yourself enough room so that you don't get trapped by enemies. Sometimes you can find special weapons inside of barriers that you can't normally find on the menu screen, which are better than the regular weapons. There's a lot I respect about this game. For 1986 standards, it's impressive that the screen moves in multiple directions. It was also unheard of to see a shoot 'em up with so many different options for weapons. The controls are weird. You have the ability to dip into the background, which lets you pass under enemies and barriers, but you can only do this when you don't have a weapon. That's kinda weird. The bosses are nothing more than reused level tiles, which is lazy. When you die, you're still able to shoot your regular bullets for some reason. I assume it's a glitch. If you have one of the special weapons, sometimes it will get overridden by a regular weapon when you make it to a certain stage. The game is also very repetitive, with very little variation between stages. Nonetheless, I do think the good outweighs the bad. For 1986 standards, you get a lot of cool and unique features. This is a good start for Data East. The company would port over some of their arcade games, and most of these are innocent enough. Here's BurgerTime. You control a chef who must drop the burger toppings to the bottom of the screen. If you walk completely over one of the toppings, it will fall down to the next row. If you plan this out correctly, you can destroy enemies this way. If you get surrounded, you can temporarily stun the enemies, but you can only do this a few times. The game is a near-perfect port of the arcade version with only a slight downgrade in graphics. You really can't get much better than this. Here's Tag Team Wrestling. We all know this is where the character Strong Bad came from. It's an early wrestling game. You can play between two different characters that you can switch out at any time. You can perform various wrestling moves which will deplete your opponent's life. If you get their life bar low enough, you can pin them and therefore win the match. You can tell it's an early wrestling game. There's only 2 teams, and you always fight against the strong bads. Even when you make it further in the game, there's only minor differences in the graphics. You're really not getting much content here. The animations are extremely poor with only 1 or 2 frames. The voice acting is some of the worst I've heard in an NES game. But still, I'm gonna go easy on it because it is an early NES title. Let's take a look at Donald Land. It's funny to think that a game based off an American fast food chain was only released in Japan. You play as Ronald McDonald and you must save your friends from captivity. You attack with apples, which can be thrown at different angles. Sometimes you need to use your own apples as platforms. The controls are terrible. It's extremely difficult to throw apples at the angle that you want. A lot of times I end up missing. I really wish you could just shoot straight ahead. When fighting the bosses, it's not always clear what the target is. There's no indication on whether you're doing damage or not. The graphics are super ugly. Ronald McDonald looks more like Raggedy Ann, and I'm not a fan of the color choices they picked for most of the stages. It's an okay game, but the controls bring it down a bit. I do give it some leeway though because it's an earlier game. Let's try Karnov. It's a platformer where you walk to the right and fight a boss at the end. You start off with a very basic projectile weapon, but you can upgrade it to a spread shot. You can collect items like a ladder which lets you reach higher areas and shoes that make you go faster. You die in 1 hit, and the difficulty is very unforgiving. It's no surprise that the game was made easier for the NES release. Now you can take 2 hits instead of just 1, and you can collect items that restore your health. It's a decent arcade port, but there's one massive flaw: the screen. The screen does a terrible job following your character, and on numerous occasions I'm almost completely on the right side where I can't see anything. When falling, the screen does not advance forward, so you have no choice but to wait until you touch the ground. The arcade version didn't have this problem. The screen was able to stay oriented with your character at all times. I assume the developers had trouble implementing multi-directional scrolling. The game uses the MMC3 mapper, which was also used in games like Super Mario Bros. 3. That game didn't have any issues in multi-directional scrolling at all, so I assume the issue was lack of experience. It's an okay game, but if it came out a few years later, I'm sure it wouldn't have had any scrolling issues. Here's a more obscure game, Cobra Command. The arcade version was an auto-scrolling shoot-'em-up, but the NES version switched up the gameplay drastically. The screen no longer moves on its own, and now your mission is to save the hostages. Throughout the stages, there's underground areas that you have to access because they contain more hostages. As you make it further through the game, you earn more upgrades that improve your weapons and speed. You can take 3 hits before you die, unless you touch a wall, which is an automatic death. The graphics are phenomenal. There's a lot of color throughout the game, and there's nice parallax scrolling at the top. The music is fantastic and captures the military atmosphere perfectly. The controls are terrible. When the screen is stationary, your helicopter moves perfectly fine across the stage, but when the screen is scrolling, your helicopter slows down significantly and it makes it harder to avoid enemies and projectiles. I think it's a glitch. The only way to remedy this is by repeatedly tapping forward so that your helicopter stays in the center. The enemies below are so difficult to hit with your weapons, and many of them have homing missiles that are near impossible to avoid. Sometimes it's hard to tell what you're able to touch and what you can't. I would have never have thought these boxes would kill me. They look like they're part of the background, don't they? Honestly, I think this is a cool concept for a game, but the bad controls ruin it for me. I think everyone here is familiar with Bad Dudes vs. Dragon Ninja. The premise is that the president was captured and you must save him. It's a beat-em-up style platformer. Unlike most games in this genre, the screen doesn't lock in place, so you technically don't have to defeat the enemies. But sometimes there's an overwhelming amount of bad guys on the screen, so you may have to fight your way out of it. There's items you can collect like nunchucks, which give you better range. You can charge up your punch, which releases a super punch that's more powerful and has better range. At the end of every stage, you fight a boss, including Karnov, which is a nice cameo. There's a decent amount of variety. There's not only platforming stages, but also auto-scrollers. The bosses also have unique attributes, so you have to come up with a new strategy each time. The graphics resemble a Super Nintendo game with nice colors and parallax scrolling in the background. The game was ported over to the NES, but some sacrifices were made. Your character moves very robotically, almost like you're on a grid. You also jump faster than you walk, and you can theoretically outrun the enemies if you keep jumping. The game has a lot more flickering, but I think that's inevitable because of how much activity there is. The boss that duplicates himself was nerfed slightly. Only 2 of the clones will attack at a time, while the rest will wait on the other platform. In the arcade version, they all come after you at once. I assume this was done to reduce flickering. Most of the levels scroll horizontally, but there's a couple that scroll vertically. In the arcade version, the vertical scrolling happens very seamlessly, but in the NES version, the screen freezes in place and moves very slowly. Was this seriously the best they could do? The game also uses the MMC3 mapper, so I'm not sure why the scrolling couldn't be smoother. The voice acting is some of the most comical I've ever heard. I'm bad. Overall, it is a bit crappier than the arcade version, but it's still playable. I just wanted to give you an idea of Data East's introduction to the NES. With how much success they were having in the arcade, it made perfect sense why they moved over to home consoles. Some of their earlier games definitely had some jank, especially when it comes to controls and scrolling. Perhaps the developers were not used to NES hardware. But with their later games, especially the ones made after 1990, we would see some significant improvements. If you made it this far into the video, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right there. And what is your experience with Data East games? Do you enjoy their NES titles? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.